are responsible for the ship's safety must face up to the threat of biological warfare, or BW. Today, BW attacks can be readily launched against us. This cloud, which would actually be invisible, is an aerosol spray. It contains a high concentration of one or more disease-producing agents. All BW attacks have the same objective: to put some kind of disease-producing organisms or poisons where men work, sleep, or eat. If the enemy succeeds and the attack is undetected, people may become sick and die. Become sick and die. Become sick and die. Become sick and die.
History repeats itself, and apparently, so do pandemics. On this episode of The Soul Trap, we talk about what has been, now is.
Everybody, listen to me, Hector. You gotta tell them, serve free these people! We gotta stop them! Stop them!
It has been said that history repeats itself. Well, bad history apparently certainly does. What we are seeing now on our screens is nothing new. It's more sophisticated and packaged better, but it's the same. The players are more informed and the public less informed. The actors have changed, but the reality is the play remains the same. The powers that be, they seem to be a bit more organized, and the stakes are higher than they have ever been. But in the end, the story of today is actually the same old story that was told yesterday. People are afraid of the jab in the arm. The question is, should they be? People are afraid of the government. Should they be? People feel as if they are lab rats being modified and manipulated and manhandled to fulfill some larger, secretive, clandestine agenda that has yet to be fully exposed. Should you feel that way? Well, you might not be as crazy as you think you are, or feel you are, or are made to feel you are, if you call into question the mainstream narrative and what is being told to you today. The story we are going to tell you is a story that has its roots in the past, but it is a story that is being experienced even to this day. The story is of a man named Edward Nevin, a bacteria, a government, and a denial. The story is best told in an article written by Zachary Crockett. Zachary Crockett writes, as leaves turned red and as San Francisco segued into the smoky autumn of 1950, a man by the name of Edward Nevin lay dying in a hospital bed. A rare bacteria had entered his urinary tract, making its way through his bloodstream and clung to his heart. A bacteria, mind you, that had never been seen before in the hospital's long history. Before researchers could hypothesize the bacteria's root cause, 10 more patients were admitted with the same infection. Doctors were baffled. How could this microbe have presented itself? For nearly 30 years, the incident remained a mystery and secret, until Edward Nevin's grandson set out to bring to light the truth and to seek out justice. What ensued was a series of terrifying revelations. For 2 decades, the United States government had intentionally dosed 293 populated areas with bacteria. They had done this with secrecy. They had done this without informing citizens of potentially dangerous exposure. They had done this without taking precautions to protect the public's health and safety, and with no medical follow-up. It all started in 1950 with the spraying of San Francisco. In 1918, toward the tail end of World War I, the government briefly experimented with ricin, a deadly natural plant protein, and the Chemical Warfare Service, known as CWS, was formed to oversee the research and development. With the signing, however, of the Geneva Protocol in 1925, which prohibited the use of biological and chemical weapons in international warfare, the U.S. government's interest waned in the project. That is, until the 1940s. Biological weapons were largely considered impractical. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, however, the United States changed its mind. In 1942, President Roosevelt signed into action, Zachary writes, the first biological warfare program. Backed by the National Academy of Sciences, the top initiative sought to develop biological weapons and explore the vulnerability of the U.S. to such an attack. A government body known as the WRS, the War Research Service, was created to oversee these activities. And a man by the name of George W. Merck of the Merck Pharmaceutical Company was appointed to the leadership. That's right. In those early days, when we thought it was nothing but mom and apple pie and 4th of July in the good old USA, you have a massive pharmaceutical drug company in bed with the United States government. Sound familiar?
The FDA moments ago approved Moderna's vaccine.
Zachary writes, at Merck's team's directive, Fort Detrick, the United States Biological Warfare, became the headquarters. It was constructed in a small town of Frederick, Maryland. The facility then embarked on top-secret plans to stage an open-air biological warfare test using the unsuspecting American public. By the end of World War II, the government had amassed a massive arsenal of biological weapons, using anthrax and other various bacteria, all under the strictest secrecy, of course. Soon, justification for continuing the research shifted to the, quote, need for national defense. Work in this field cannot be ignored in a time of peace, Merck warned officials. It must be continued on a sufficient scale to provide an adequate defense. The government agreed with the head of the pharmaceutical company. Under the command of the University of Wisconsin professor and bacteriologist Ira Baldwin, a committee on biological warfare was established in 1948. There is an important side note here that we must take note of. It seems that often there is a deep connection between the university system and the clandestine groups within the government like the CIA and others. This was so in MK projects, Artichoke, the Monarch projects, and all of its offshoots. And the university system today is still, mind you, under the control of some of the most dark and hideous powers that be. Zachary's article goes on to state, quote, when a subsequent report determined that the United States was particularly susceptible to attacks, a series of open-air tests were ordered. The purpose of these efforts? Well, they were to simulate the effects of a realistic biological warfare attack. With a plan in place, a task force was sent to unleash bacteria in San Francisco. A confidential government report written in 1951 entitled Special Report Number 142, Biological Warfare Trials at San Francisco, California, maps out the details of the city's top-secret bacteria bombing. Through the tests, officials sought to accomplish three objectives. First, to study the offensive possibilities of attacking a seaport within a biological warfare arsenal. It was also designed to highlight the vulnerability of the country's defenses against such an attack. And finally, it was designed to gain data on how bacteria affected a population. Nowhere in the report was the welfare of the people of San Francisco mentioned. The tests proceeded without knowledge or consent from the public. On the 20th, just 3 days after the 49ers made their NFL debut, the U.S. Army was deployed to San Francisco and began secretly showering the city with bacteria. You heard that right. Over the course of 8 days, a ship moved along silently, quietly, along the shoreline of the bay, releasing massive clouds of two different pathogens, both of which were supposedly non-pathogenic, yet realistic simulants that might be used in an attack. In total, 6 experimental warfare attacks were carried out. Now remember that the next time you are mocked for wondering why there are so many chemtrails, or asking questions about HAARP, you are not crazy for calling into question your government. Crockett writes, the Army blasted 3 chemicals in 30-minute spurts, producing huge clouds up to 2 miles in length, then proceeded to collect and assess dozens of samples of various spots across the city. As noted in the report, various aspects of each of the 6 tests were scrupulously monitored. The time, the temperature, the wind speed, the humidity, but the most important factor seemed to be brushed over: the well-being of the people that were sprayed, or rather poisoned. The samples collected yielded countless numbers of information and gave indication of how much bacteria was being inhaled. According to Leonard J. Cole, author of the biological warfare book called Clouds of Secrecy, it was quite a bit of information. He states nearly all of San Francisco received 500 particles per minute per liter. In other words, nearly every one of the 800,000 people in San Francisco exposed to the cloud at a normal breathing rate inhaled 5,000 or more particles per minute during the several hours that remained airborne. Since the Army's bacteria presented similar dosage patterns, he continued, San Francisco residents were inhaling millions of bacteria and particles every day during the week of the testing. San Francisco residents' safety was wholly brushed over in the report, which promptly concluded it's entirely feasible to attack a seaport city with a biological weapon. A month prior to the Army's tests, a 75-year-old man named Edward Nevin checked into a San Francisco hospital to undergo a prostate gland surgery. The procedure went well, and after a month in the facility, he was on his way to recovery. Then, on September 29th, 2 days after the Army's tests, mysteriously Nevin fell sick and contracted a urinary tract infection, falling gravely ill. When the man's urine culture came back, it contained a bacteria that had not once been documented in the hospital's long history. In mid-October, the bacteria spread to Nevin's heart, and eventually, soon after, he died. Over the next 6 months, 10 more patients were admitted with infections. Like the rest of San Francisco's citizens, the hospital's doctors were unaware that the government had just sprayed the city. A panic ensued at the hospital as researchers frantically struggled to determine how the bacteria infected these people. When the government realized that they'd caused a bacteria outbreak, they reeled and tried their best to cover their tracks. In August of 1952, a secret 4-person investigation was ordered by Fort Detrick Commander General William Creasy to reassess the pathogenic nature. In a 2-page report, the investigators admitted that the bacteria was not, quote, an ideal simulant, and mused that the likelihood it had killed Nevin was considerable. Despite this, they proceeded to justify its continued use in biological tests. Throughout the report, investigators showed little remorse for the infected civilians, Zachary writes. General Creasy was equally unfazed, and all the while, the public remained completely in the dark about what was going on. For 25 years, the government's involvement in the biological warfare testing and its use of civilians as unwitting guinea pigs, lab rats, remained top secret. It's a secret that likely would have gone on indefinitely if not for the efforts of a savvy Newsweek reporter named Drew Featherston. In November 1976, Featherston exposed a number of biological tests performed in major cities by the Army and the CIA. Using his research, the San Francisco Chronicle also uncovered the bacteria spraying that had occurred in its streets in 1950. Edwin Nevin III, a young lawyer in San Francisco, later was waiting for a train in a nearby Berkeley train depot when he read the news. When he skimmed the name of the man who died from the bacteria, Edward Nevin, he reeled in shock. Good heavens, he muttered to himself, that was my grandfather. Growing up, he'd been told that his father's father had died from kidney disease. Now that he knew the bitter truth, he felt a need to exact revenge in the form of justice. Nevin wrote the government, demanding access to the case's related documents. Of course, his request was denied. Though the Freedom of Information Act had just been enacted, the government maintained that all files were classified, despite the fact that the media had already exposed the incident. In turn, Nevin sued the government to the tune of $11 million. Our motive, he stated, is to obtain information. He told a group of reporters that's why he asked for that amount. He stated, quote, "Would you fellas have paid attention if the claim were for only a few $1,000s?" Well, the government tried to dismiss the case on the grounds that they were immune from lawsuits involving basic policy and claiming the right for national defense, but the request was denied. Samuel Conti, a federal judge, was appointed to preside over the trial, and a date was set for mid-1977. In light of this news, the government decided it was best to relinquish some of its information. And in February of 1977, an extensive history called, quote, U.S. Army Activity in the Biological Warfare Program from 1942 to 1977 was released, chronicling the country's involvement, note, in open-air testing. For the first time in history, the truth was now coming to light. From March to May of 1977, a series of hearings commenced in the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research. Military experts, medical experts, leaders, and politicians ferociously debated whether or not the bacteria that killed Nevin was legal and right to have been released. Meanwhile, Nevin III's trial was postponed or rescheduled a half dozen times from 1977 to 1980. So much for swift justice. Zachary continues to write, by the time a trial was set in stone for the date of March 16, 1981, he'd already spent some $60,000 on legal fees and was mentally and emotionally drained. Nonetheless, he found solace in the case's stipulations. To win, all he'd have to do is show that there was a probability, which had already been mentioned in the Army's own investigation, or a greater than 50% chance that the Army's germs were responsible for his grandfather's death. And as a lawyer, he'd have the opportunity to defend his own family in court. As the trial began, the evidence seems to be overwhelmingly in favor of Nevin III's case. On September 26th and 27th, it's clear the government had sprayed the city with bacteria. On September 29th, that same bacteria showed up in his grandfather's system and directly led to his death. What more needs to be said? We've been nothing but loyal to this country, Nevin told the Judge Conti in his opening statement, and we feel betrayed. His argument was threefold. The bacteria sprayed by the government directly caused his grandfather's death. The Army used the bacteria despite inadequate testing, and since they'd sprayed it without consent, it had been, quote, an act of negligence. He questioned the legality of these actions, quote, on what basis of law does the U.S. government of the United States justify the dispersion of a large collection of bacteria over the civilian population in an experiment without informed consent? A rational question. An irrational fear. John Kern, the sharp, respected attorney representing the government, of course denied all of these allegations. The bacteria that killed Nevin and the bacteria released by the Army were two entirely different strains, he maintained. It was just mere coincidence that the hospital had an outbreak around the same time. Incredibly, Kern also attested that the Army needed no permission to spray the public without consent or knowledge. The Federal Tort Claims Act, established in 1946, gave the public the right to sue the federal government, but it came with limitations, he argued. Among them, a vaguely worded, quote, discretionary function. How much evil has our government perpetrated, may I ask, under that one word, discretionary? Kern argued that it made the feds immune to lawsuits in which they were, quote, performing appropriately under policy. The dosing of civilians in bacteria, contended Kern, qualified as such. One of Kern's witnesses, a doctor for the Biological Warfare Unit at Fort Detrick, agreed. Imagine that, a doctor agreeing with the government.
Yes, yes, and yes, yes, yes.
In possibly the most callous statement of the entire court proceedings, the doctor looked at Nevin in the eyes and delivered this opinion, quote, the strain wasn't pathogenic, he said, and I would still spray San Francisco again today. Dr. Wheat, the Stanford physician who'd investigated Nevin's death in 1951, testified to a different tune. No similar organisms had ever been isolated in the hospital laboratory. Then, over a relatively short period of time, there were a number of cases, he told the judge. It's very difficult for me as a doctor to escape the conclusion that there is at least some, here's the word, probability, some causal effect that the cases are related. Now, today, if that doctor had been on Facebook, he would have been censored. Debates on the bacteria's safety and the cause of Nevin's death continued in this way for several hours, each side presenting a slew of medical experts. Sound familiar?
Thank you.
The government's legal team maintained that the odds of Nevin's death being linked to the Army's bacteria spray were, quote, 1 in 100. Nevin III's witnesses held the belief that the events were inseparably connected. When it came time to examine the military officials, the case, however, suddenly took a jarring turn, Zachary writes. As General William Creasy, commander of the United States Biological Warfare Unit, stepped to the stand, it became clear that the presiding Judge Conte was leaning toward the defense of the military. Really, the actors change, but the play remains the same, does it not? You have pharmaceutical, military, and the judge and the law supporting them all. When the government trotted out its witnesses in uniform, noted one San Francisco examiner, it was all over. After telling Nevin III that he was, quote, wasting his time, the general proceeded to defend the ethics of spraying people without their knowledge. I would find it completely impossible to conduct such a test, trying to obtain informed consent. I could not have hoped to prevent panic in the uninformed world in which we live, telling them that we were going to spread a non-pathogenic particle over their community. 99% of the people wouldn't know what pathogenic meant, and so he told what we have come to call a noble lie. Kind of like, you don't need to wear a mask. Oh, you need to wear a mask. Oh, you need to wear 2 masks.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask.
Masks are very important.
If you have a physical covering with one layer, you put another layer on, it just makes common sense.
During the cross-examination, Judge Conte continually denied Nevin III's reasoning and even berated him for his lack of respect towards military officials. After several interruptions, Judge Conte altogether halted the questioning and called a recess out of nowhere. Out in the hallway, a belligerent General Creasy unsuccessfully actually challenged Nevin III to a fist fight. Nevin III's legal opponents were simply too powerful. He was swimming upstream and flailing. When Judge Conte's verdict was handed down on May 20th, 1981, it surprised no one. The case was ruled in favor of the government. The Army, it seems, had been entitled to spray the population without consent, concluded Conte, under, you guessed it, the discretionary function exemption. Despite a lack of convincing evidence, Conte also declared that the Army had skillfully chosen its bacteria and that it was not, in fact, harmful. For Nevin III, whose grandfather had died from the organisms, this was not easy to swallow. He appealed, but the U.S. Court of Appeals did not overturn the verdict. He appealed again, this time to the Supreme Court, and received a similar verdict from the Supreme Court. For Nevin III, justice was not served. San Francisco's incident was just one of 293 bacterial attacks staged by the United States government between 1950 and 1969. It was neither the most heinous nor the most deadly. In 1955, as an experiment, the CIA actually sprayed whooping cough over Tampa Bay, Florida. Whooping cough cases in the area subsequently increased from 339 and 1 death in 1954 to over 1,000 cases and over a dozen deaths in 1955. But no hard evidence has ever surfaced linking the two incidents, we are told. In an infamous 1966 test, federal agents crushed light bulbs containing trillions of bacteria on the New York subway, exposing thousands of rush hour commuters. The government never followed up to see how many people fell ill. And let's not forget, we have the incidents of the United States government intentionally infecting people in Guatemala and other locations with sexually transmitted diseases. Prisoners, college students, the testings have gone on and on and on, decade after decade. All, of course, under the discretionary function. Before a crowd at Fort Detrick in 1969, Richard Nixon officially terminated the offensive use of biological weapons in the United States, effectively ending open-air testing. And of course, we have no reason to doubt that because it was Richard Nixon, and we can trust Richard Nixon.
Well, I'm not a crook.
It wouldn't be until 1977 that the public learned any of this was even going on. And even then, the United States government never admitted its fault or seemed to show any indication of remorse for its actions. Edward Nevin III now is a practicing medical malpractice and personal injury lawyer in California. Though he lost the case in 1981, he succeeded in bringing to light many government actions that had previously been shrouded in secrecy. He stated, "At least we are all aware of what can happen even in this country. I just hope the story," he said, "will never be forgotten." Does history repeat itself? It most certainly does. And now we come to the age of the results and the fruit of Operation
Warp Speed.
The drugs that we are putting into our arms are all the result of an operation instigated at the command of our president, then Donald Trump, and those around him, called Operation Warp Speed. We often think of the term warp speed for the Star Trek terminology, but the word warp means to turn or twist out of shape, to cause, to judge, to choose or act wrongly or abnormally, to pervert or distort. That is what warp actually means in the English language. We are told daily how safe and sound the are, how silly we are to question or think dark conspiratorial thoughts, but there is a darkness that pervades, there is a body count, and there is a high price to having an empire like ours. It doesn't come at a cheap price. Sacrifices must be made. Secrecies must be maintained. It's better to keep our heads in the sand, because to wake from the matter of casual comfort is to see just how dark and dirty the rabbit hole actually is. But let's circle around and maybe put a bow on our story. Remember the man, Merck, the famous drug company mentioned early on that worked hand in hand with the United States government. Well, that pharmaceutical company is named for the Merck family, a German family, one might say, who is somewhat familiar with Operation Paperclip. A German family of industrialists and bankers. The family still owns the majority of the pharmaceutical company, Merck. But you don't find them named Merck, because not all that long ago, they merged with another company. That company is called Pfizer. What's so special about Pfizer? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is where you're getting what is being pumped into you today may have been sprayed over San Francisco 70 years ago. But don't worry. I'm sure it's all a strange coincidence. There's nothing here to see. Take wear your mask, move along. History is just simply repeating itself.
This film will first show what the Navy is planning for the offensive employment of biological and chemical warfare. Biological and chemical warfare have two principal objectives: to reduce the enemy's production of food by destroying his crops and his food-producing farm animals, and to incapacitate the enemy's armed forces and that portion of his human population that directly supports them. Navy delivery and dispersion of the agents started with tests made in 1950. A rather crude spraying system was installed on a mine layer, which in September of that year secretly cruised off California and sprayed some 50 gallons of biological stimulant along a track 2 to 5 miles offshore.
everybody.